My guest on the Bryan Callen Show is Dr. Sumantra Maitra. And that's how you say your last name, I think, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Senior editor at the American Conservative, a senior fellow at the Center of Renewing America, and an elected associate fellow at the Royal Historical Society. You can follow him on Twitter at Mr. Maitra, Maitra. I love that. I want my Twitter handle to be Mr. Bryan Callen. Welcome. We were just talking about the state of academia, and then I want to get into the Ukraine, because I want you to educate me on the fact that you think we shouldn't be in Ukraine, and my instinct is to say, let's stick it to the Russians because we can, even though it's ugly. But we'll get into that. I'll try to make my argument, and then you'll educate me, because you're the one with the PhD here. Okay, I'm just an actor / comic. So what do I know? But academia is something that I think the state of academia is what to you? I know it probably depends, but I just feel like there are a lot of bad ideas that not only come out of academia, are higher institutions, more prestigious institutions like Princeton, Harvard, but they stick. They stick. I mean, gender ideology and, for example, or just even critical race theory. I've done my research and my homework on some of this stuff, but it just doesn't seem to have practical applications.
Right. So how long do you have?
Probably not long enough. You came here to talk about Ukraine, so I don't want to steer you.
I was gonna say, yeah.
Let's.
No, fair enough.
Yeah, let's get into this.
The brief, right? Higher education. The couple of very small things which I want to mention, so that but it is a subject which is very, very close to me, because I am an academic at the end of the day. Like some people are just born kind of like with an academic kind of mindset. I prefer to be in academia, but I obviously am not. I'm more in policy and research and writing, and part of the reason is because I am not very optimistic about how much it can be reformed. I was supposed to be a professor before I got a new job and moved to the US. But anyway, the fundamental point of one of the reasons why academia is so bad today is a simple statistic that I can give you. In US, in the last 30 years, the percentage increase of faculty has been around 10%. Percentage increase of faculty in the last 30 years in the United States has been around 10%. Now, if you have to take a guess of the equivalent percentage of rise or increase in administration in the exact same 30 years, what would be your guess?
I would imagine.
Take a guess. Any number. Take a guess.
Percentage-wise?
Yeah.
100%. In other words, there's been a 100% increase in administrators around that, probably. Something crazy. I mean, yeah.
Right. It's 221%.
My God. It's so a 10% in faculty, and you've got all these supporting actors, and what do they do?
Yeah.
What do they do?
Right. And this is the interesting thing. The debate about academia in the US and in the UK is essentially like either everything is good or everything is bad, it needs to be burned down. The problem is not the same. When people say, for example, grad students used to get a lot more jobs, but grad students don't get a lot more jobs today. And first of all, I show them when you're talking about a PhD student, you need to understand on what subject and what topic he's doing a PhD.
That's right.
Depending on the subject and the job proportions. If someone is doing a PhD on, let's take my field, like foreign policy and military strategy focused on Europe, chances of him getting a job is a little bit higher than someone doing a PhD on, for example, writing standards in letters from trenches in the First World War or something like that, right? I mean, and that too could be at least historical compared to something like feminist geography. Right. Or something like that. Right. Depending on the subject, you have a job offer. That's one thing. So it's kind of like, I wouldn't say foolish, but it's definitely defeatist to say that all the departments are equally bad. But the most important thing is the rise of administration. One of the reasons why, for example, the tuition fee increased in academia is because you are paying for the university to fund all these people. There was a time when if you're about to do a PhD, you don't need mental health counseling because it was expected that you're doing a PhD, which means you know what kind of grueling thing you would have to suffer, like nights and days of just sitting in the library and doing something. But obviously, because of the rise of administration, these people come in and get their jobs, and they kind of like, how do I put it? Like encourage fragility or weakness in a student, right? So it's kind of like it's the nature of bureaucracy, and it's the same in British NHS to NATO to university higher ed. Like bureaucracy is the same everywhere, right? I mean, they are self-sustaining. They perpetuate their own justification of existence.
That's right.
And that's also one of the reasons why you have a rise of, increase in tuition fees, decline in the quality of, research, and all these new fads coming in, and they kind of like latch onto it. So if someone comes and tells you
I think they're gonna become more and more irrelevant. I think you're going to be able to get an education online, or create the information's out there, and so then you're left with sort of, well, go to Harvard because you'll make contacts. If you go to Williams, a lot of the kids there fly privately. That means their dads are in positions of power, and you might get a great job after that. That's kind of what it's about. But I don't know, and you're going to get a good education, but it does seem like $400,000 for a 4-year education in queer studies or gender theory or whatever it might be. If you've got the money, all right, but good luck. But you're going to get a job in some, human resources department maybe if you're lucky, or back in academia.
You're absolutely. I mean, so the purpose of higher education in both the UK and US was not just, so there were two types of higher education. One is the classical education, which forms the kind of like social elite groups, right? I mean, they go on to lead in the government or work in the big finance, systems in New York and Wall Street, all that kind of stuff. And the other is like the technical education and engineering and all that kind of. But obviously, because of the dilution of academic quality, all of these things kind of got mixed, and now you're paying the exact same money as someone who's studying history and wants to be, or someone who's studying law. And then the return that they're getting from the subject is obviously not as equal as a lawyer who's going to make that much amount of money. So he's going to go and pull a fine all his life, and he's going to have like student debt, which is an exorbitant amount of money.
Exactly. You're part of a country club, and it costs you a fortune, and you can't get out of debt.
There you go.
All right.
Exactly.
Speaking of debt, and speaking of spending money on things you don't want to spend, let's shift to Ukraine, and let's talk about what you think and whether or not the United States and its allies should be supporting this war effort, or should I say the defense of Ukraine. Russia has done something like this probably 9 times in the past, 20 years. And no one has stopped them. I'm thinking of what they did to Grozny, turned it into rubble. Crimea, of course. There are a lot of examples. But this time, not so much, probably because Ukraine said no way, and also because it seems to me that Europe somehow had to have been a little bit worried that they weren't going to stop at Ukraine, that they were going to keep rolling. Thoughts?
Right.
Should we be there or not? Should we? Let's start with this. Should we be supporting Ukraine? Should we be sending weapons, etc.?
We should be supporting Ukraine. We should not be sending weapons. The Europeans should be sending weapons. We should be facilitating the Europeans to spend money in their own backyard. We absolutely should give Russia a bloody nose, but we shouldn't be on the front line of giving that bloody nose. Someone else should take responsibility. We should push them forward. To answer very briefly, whether Russia is a bad actor, absolutely. What they've done in Ukraine is horrible and goes against international law, yes. Is it in our interest? Probably not. And that obviously needs more elaboration, so we're going to talk about that anyway. But yeah, that's your answer.
Yeah, I will say that Ukraine's, and let me say some things and then tell me if I'm on. Ukraine seems to have been flirting with NATO membership for a long time, and the United States made it somewhat clear that they wouldn't interfere with that membership. And everyone knew that was a red line in the sand for Putin and for the Russians. Everyone knew that Ukraine joining NATO was a direct threat to Russia's national security, and there was no way they weren't going in to stop that. Yet, it seems that Ukraine, there were two provocations that I see. One, there was a coup of a democratically elected pro-Russian president. He was kicked out, Zelensky was put in. I don't know who helped with that, but my guess is the United States had something to do with it. And then Ukraine's sort of not so subtle bid at NATO membership. Thoughts?
Okay, so to go into the current conflict, we sort of need to look back to a little bit of Russian history in general, but also modern Russian history in particular. So Russia, as a great power since the time of Catherine the Great, never really had defensible boundaries. You know, it's a very paranoid culture, strategic culture, not like general.
It's also very flat. It's also very flat. I've been there. It's very flat topography, right? It's very easy for a country to roll into.
I mean, think of this way. The closest word to safety in the Russian language is bezopasnost, which means no danger. They do not have a single word for safety in their entire language.
Wow.
So they have been invaded by the Mongols, they have been invaded by the Swedes, the Polish-Lithuanians, Kaiser, Germany, Hitler, Napoleon, you name it, right? The only thing, like any strong Russian leader, and whoever that might be, whether it's a communist or a czarist or a democratic Russian leader, they would still want to have defensible boundaries around them, like having buffer zones. So that's the strategic. If you read Russian military journals, regardless, Russia is a very difficult country to read because, we are democratic. So any debate that's going on, there's a thing called process tracing, the way you can go and get the archival notes, for example, whether it's a national archive in the US or, in the parliament in the UK. You can't do that in Kremlin. Obviously, you would never know what Putin is talking to his closest personal advisors, probably up until the next 100 years when they're going to be unsealed. Even then, you might not know about them. So what you have to study, when you're studying Russian foreign policy is what they're writing in the military journals, what they're writing, what speeches they're giving to their own people, not to the others, not in the English language, not a signaling to the foreign, governments, but to their own people. So that's how you study. And then you kind of match them with Russian, movements or their military positions. And you kind of oh, this is tallying together. So maybe this is their foreign policy direction, right? So that's the way you study Russian foreign policy because it's a closed society. So that's historic Russian foreign policy. Now, when Putin came to power in 1999, he came to power trying to start a new kind of détente with the West.
He's been in power 24 years?
Yeah, God. Yeah. In between, he was the prime minister when Medvedev was in power. Right. But at the end of the day, it was still in his hand. Yeah. So when he first came to power, he realized that Yeltsin fumbled in subduing the Chechens, which is the Grozny and all those countries. So he has to deal with them, right? Now the Chechens at that point of time was a nationalist movement. They were not Islamists; they just wanted their own national independence, but they were still fighting Russia. So what the Russians did under Putin is colored them as Islamists because we at that point of time were already facing different kind of Islamist problems. So they wanted to have a patch. They wanted to have this.
We couldn't interfere. We couldn't interfere because we're doing the same thing, right? They put
right, and also we would emotionally feel a sympathy, oh, look at this, and the Chechens were equally brutal. Let's not color them as some kind of saint.
They were brutal, yeah.
Yeah, they gassed a whole bunch of kids just for the funds. We all remember anyone who's around 40 or 40 up remembers how brutal Chechens were at one point of time. Anyway,
well, the last straw was when they bombed that school, when they firebombed. They rigged that school.
Beslan. I mean, it was horrific. You know,
I remember.
We remember the
Putin hit. He hit the there was a Russian waiter. I used to go to this restaurant, and he was a great guy.
Yeah.
And I said, "What do you think?" He goes, "They should all die. Kill them all like dogs." And I went,
Yeah.
It was just like that was the red line for the Russians. They went, "Oh, you killed a bunch of school children? Okay, watch this."
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
Uh-oh.
It's a joke among, you know, people who study Russian military history. Like, you know, when the Americans or the Brits go for counterinsurgency, you know, we try and kind of avoid civilian casualties. When the Russians go, like they flatten the building. You know, it doesn't. You know, they're like 100 hostages, 50 terrorists. You get 150 body bags. You know, that's just how they do their war. Like it's a different war culture, right? So when Putin came to power in '99, he wanted to solve the Chechen problem, and then obviously within 2 years' time, 9/11 happened, and he thought, this is my opportunity. We're going to start this understanding with the West, and I'm going to help them get bases in Central Asia because they have to go to Afghanistan. They have to get the troops, you know, through the Central Asian skyline, and I'm going to help them because that's my sphere of influence. And in return, Bush and Tony Blair will not say anything because we are going to kill Chechens in our own backyard. So that was the tacit sort of understanding in his mind.
Yeah.
Now that changed after the color revolutions in 2003 and 2004. We encouraged, broadly speaking, the revolutions. I don't think we directly funded them, at least at that point of time. But we definitely sort of encouraged with civil society. You know, we kind of like USAID had a whole bunch of money spent on, you know, Georgia and Ukraine. And those were obviously, and Putin kind of felt betrayed because of that, you know, and Kosovo, obviously, you know, before that, they thought like Kosovo, you know, whenever Russia goes to war, they take up the Kosovo precedence and they say like, if you guys could do that to a democratically elected government, so can we. And that's, you know, the kind of,
they use Kosovo. They use Kosovo as their
Kosovo as their justification. Like, wow. You know, that's when the international law changed. You bombed a country which had got nothing to do with the United Nations. It had got nothing to do with, it didn't even attack you. It was essentially, from their perspective, doing a law and order situation issue, and they were like having their own riots and their own problems. And you just went and bombed it because you had you had power at that point. We couldn't do anything. So now that we have power, we're going to do exactly. And in Georgia in 2008, when Russia went,
I'm sorry to interrupt. We bombed Kosovo because they were aligned with the Serbs. Is that what happened?
The Kosovars were opposed to the Serbs. The Serbs were we were opposed to Serbia, and Serbia was aligned with Russia.
Right.
Because they had that.
But Kosovo was aligned with Serbia, yeah?
Kosovo was opposed to Serbia.
So why did we bomb Kosovo?
Because Kosovo was Serbian troops were there in Kosovo.
Got it. Right.
Right. So there was part of the entire Yugoslavian campaign.
That's right.
Right. And that's what Putin said, like, you know, and that's the justification he gave in 2008 when he went to Georgia. It was like, you know, the Georgian troops are killing civilians. We are going to go and have a humanitarian intervention in Georgia. Technically, he's right. You know, we use we can say that obviously that's a lopsided justification and that has got no merit, but this is international politics, you know. It's just how the game is played.
Yeah.
So Putin kind of felt betrayed around 2003 and 4, and then there was still, you know, and by 2007 he was like, you know, he went to Munich conference and he gave us that famous speech, like, you know, the United States is a hyperpower. It doesn't really care about any international law. And if it doesn't care about any international law, we are going to balance it regardless of the cost. That happened. Hillary Clinton came and started to have this detente with Russia, reset button and all that kind of stuff. And immediately after that, we went to an intervention in Libya. So every single time, both they and I, you know, they and we wanted to have this kind of detente. After that, there is some kind of Western intervention, and Putin was, you know, he was like, you know, you guys are not straight, and you're not true to your cause.
Yeah, I think that the hypocrisy, the hypocrisy in the United States has always bit us in the ass in the Middle East and in Russia, places like that, because they just go, look at the way you guys are. I always remind people that I'm not a fan of Putin's or Russian politics, but if you compare Putin to any other leader, I mean, compare him to Khrushchev, Stalin, Lenin. I mean, any of the old school Brezhnev. There is who is the other one? But any of the old school dictators or heads of the Politburo or whatever. he is as close. He is so different in so many ways. He didn't kill people wholesale. You know, he didn't. He just didn't.
And also, this is the thing. Like when people study Putin, like obviously he's a weird kind of guy. He was former KGB, and he's got his own sense of historical,
still ruthless.
Idea of Russia.
Yeah.
He's very ruthless. But throughout his career, he constantly tried to reach out. You know, during the Iraq War, for example, he tried to reach out
rational.
to France.
Yeah, he's very rational. I can see him saying, "Let's partner with the United States so my economy can. Let's make some money."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So anyway, in 2008, around the time, or probably just before the Georgian invasion of Russia, and that's kind of like what propelled me to do a PhD, essentially. Like, I was like, I need to study this country because it's just so fascinating. This was after the Munich conference speech in 2007, and there was this NATO conference in Bucharest in 2008. Where Ukraine and Georgia were candidate states, and they came to observe. And the Europeans, because they cannot decide anything substantially, and because their entire ideological spectrum is one of liberalism, of liberal internationalism, where there are no borders or boundaries and all that kind of stuff. But also, they understand the real reason that they cannot have Ukraine and Georgia in NATO, because what they did was promised Ukraine and Georgia that they're going to be NATO candidates, but never specified a time. And that was the worst of both worlds. Because to Ukraine and Georgia, that meant that they could be adventurous because NATO would come and save them. And to Russia, that meant there is no point in us holding anything back because this is just coming to our own border. So if we could have said that, Ukraine and Georgia would be like Austria or Finland or Switzerland, like neutral buffer, and we are not going to be, and you're not going to be, that would have been fine.
Would have made sense. Would have made sense for Georgia and Ukraine, actually.
Right. I mean, sometimes I just look at Ukraine and think, like, did their leaders at that point of time even think the number of people? 8 million of them are refugees now in Europe.
It's unbelievable. And
if you were living in that time and if you were the leader, would you have done something else? Probably. I mean, if I knew my country was going to face that, I probably would have at least thought about it, right?
Well, yeah, you would have assured the Russian bear that you weren't looking to arm yourself to the teeth with NATO weaponry. Right. But what percentage of Ukraine identifies as Russian? Isn't there a large percentage? The Crimea, of course, Donbass region.
Crimea has been historically Russian. I mean, in the West, people don't really, we don't consider it's like saying, it's like having Russians coming and telling you the entire Louisiana purchase is wrong because, and we are just going to fund them weapons or going to UK and saying
they're all Russian. They're all Russian, the Crimea, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Crimea has been historically Russian since Catherine the Great.
Wow.
It is one of their biggest naval forts. I mean, they won some of their greatest battles against the Turks, the Ottomans, based in Sevastopol. If we just go and tell them, like, there is no history of Crimea in Russia and it just belongs to Ukraine because Khrushchev signed a piece of paper.
Now there are too many Russians that died. There are too many Russians that died defending and winning that territory.
It is in their blood. Yeah. So that's one thing. The eastern parts of Ukraine, it's not just about how many Russians there too as well. Some of it is strategic. So what I mean by that is Russians, for example, do not. We tend to think that, because of NATO expansion, Russians went to war. That's half true. On one hand, yes, it is kind of related to NATO expansion. But on the other hand, NATO has expanded to a lot of different countries. Russians didn't go to war all the time, right?
Ukraine was always going to be invaded, wasn't it? I mean, the Russians were always going to invade.
Yes, and the reason for that is the eastern parts of Ukraine, yes, they're mostly Russian speakers. Yes, they're like historically has been Russian lands, but also two very important causes that we tend to miss. One, the Russian military supply chains are based in the old Soviet factories, which are part of eastern Ukraine.
Wow.
So some of the hydraulics for example, some of the silos for their missiles are still manufactured in Donbass. They already had this understanding with the Ukrainian government that they would be manufactured continuously even after the split of the Soviet Union. But that started to change around 2003 when Ukraine started sort of move towards the West. The Russians knew that that's going to stop, right? The Russians tried to diversify and buy Mistral warships from France, but obviously that was sanctioned, and the French just said that we are not going to sell it to you after the Georgian invasion. So that's one thing. The second is a lot of Russian cheese and wine goes to the Ukrainian market, or at least used to go to the Ukrainian market. I don't know.
I didn't know the Russians.
Anymore, but
I didn't know the Russians made wine or cheese.
Yeah. So so it used to go there. From the Russian perspective, the European Union and NATO, US is no different. It's the West. Now, if Ukraine joins the European Union, it doesn't join NATO, if just only the European Union, it would still have quality control on any kind of import that they have. Russian goods are not going to come to the Ukrainian market. So that was a red line for Russia at that point of time. Now, obviously, they have pulled the trigger. So, the bird is dead, so to speak. But at that point of time, they were thinking like we could push them to the brink, threaten them with our forces, take Crimea, and then see if they kind of like change their course. So that obviously didn't really work out the way Putin envisaged, but, that's also one of the reasons. So fundamentally, briefly to answer your question, the invasion is obviously bad, but in international politics, we don't really do good or bad. We kind of like try and find the justification to why things have happened. And there has been historic reasons why we are seeing the kind of behavior of Russia in certain countries. I have to insist on that. Not in Montenegro, not in Finland, not in Estonia, not in Poland, but Ukraine, Georgia, and I'm guessing if NATO tomorrow wants to go to Central Asian republics, it's going to be the exact same thing. Like there are some regions which are historic Russian lands, and they have that kind of understanding of their geography that way.
So what do you think? Do you think Russia is thinking back this was a mistake? Because right now they are, these sanctions and as isolated as they are, they're going to have trouble growing food. They need parts for those tractors, parts for all that are, for their agricultural apparatus and infrastructure. They can't get those things unless they're internally made. It seems to be, I guess they're still selling their oil because the Europeans really need it, or natural gas, I should say. Is this a mistake? Are they looking at themselves as this was, we had no choice? What are they thinking?
I don't think the Russians think that they have made a mistake. I think from their point of view, first of all, again, like this is, people tend not to do, and understandably tend not to do, analysis when it comes to foreign policy, because that might lead to very dark spaces, when you just wholesale talk about one culture and that cultural difference with, that could lead to very dangerous situations. But all that being said, the Russian state has got a very different strategic culture compared to the West. They can take for what they consider their core interests an enormous amount of punishment for them to achieve those core interests.
An enormous amount of punishment would be 1 million lost or something crazy like that, or 500,000 people dying.
Not just death, but also just decline in their lifestyle, And that's understandable. Look, one of the simple reasons that Americans, or at least a significant section of Americans, are kind of sore about giving aid to Ukraine is because geography is destiny. The First and the Second World War was different because the fundamental grand strategy of the United States is that you cannot let Western Europe or Eastern Asia capitulate to one single hegemon. The reason, geography. If you lose the English Channel, you have a base to launch a seaborne invasion to the eastern shores and cross the Atlantic. If you lose the Pacific, Guam, and all those islands, then you can do the same to the western shore. at the end of the day, when you're forming grand strategy, values doesn't really matter. What matters is geography and, all that kind of considerations, all that variables. Aggregate power, it's nothing related to human rights. It's aggregate power. So if tomorrow there were a Soviet threat or a Russian threat, which would have covered the entirety of Central Europe, the entirety of Western Europe, threatening the UK, threatening the English Channel, threatening the Atlantic seaborne routes, I'm absolutely certain a lot more Americans would be like, we need to go and do something about it. But that changes the further the threat of the war is. So that's one thing. The second, so the reason I'm saying this is the further the war is from us, the closer it is to Russian borders. To them, that's their core interest, like Cuba and Canada to us. Crimea is to the Russians. They can take an enormous amount of punishment, or they're willing to take at least an enormous amount of punishment. So that's one thing. The second, I am uncertain of this assessment that the Russians are actually marginalized in the international community. I know we hear that in BBC and CNN, but if you actually look at the reality, the African countries, majority of the African countries have normal trade ties with.
Keep going. So you're saying the Russians are not as marginalized as we would think. They have a relationship with Africa. They have a relationship with China.
That's right. And the oil thing is the most interesting because ever since the invasion started, do you know who the Russians are selling the most amount of oil? To India.
Oh, India.
Yeah. You know what the Indians are doing?
Selling it to
China.
Europe. Yeah, selling it to Europe? Okay.
Yeah. So the Europeans, on one hand, they're supposed to have sanctions on Russia, so they're not directly trading with Russia. They're selling it to the Indians are making money out of it, and that's great. They're doing great.
Yeah.
They saw an opportunity.
Does India produce any of its own oil or natural gas? No. So they need it. No. So they're buying it from the Russians.
Yeah.
Quietly.
They're buying it cheap from the Russians.
Anything.
They're selling it more expensive to the Europeans, and they're making a whole bunch of money out of it as middlemen. Like
are they
classic,
not? They're not selling it to China. Where's China getting their oil?
No. I mean, the Indians and Chinese don't really see eye to eye on a lot of things.
They don't.
Yeah. But anyway, so the point is, if you have 2/3 of humanity essentially either neutral or tacitly supporting you, I don't think you're that marginalized. That assessment to me kind of is flawed. We tend to think that global opinion is just European Union, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and US. It's a little different when you see from the other side of the lens,
Especially the losing side of history. We always keep forgetting that a lot of the countries were on the losing side of history, at least for the 20th century. And that's a very strong memory for everyone. They have a very different perspective. I said the other day, today, I was watching Ronald Reagan's speech, and I said, I always, when I hear him, I get a warm, fuzzy feeling about the way America was. And then my friend said, unless you were black or gay, then you'd have a very different point of view. Said, you're right. So it depends on what lens you're looking from. Yeah.
And also, I'm glad you mentioned the perspective thing, because in foreign policy, you cannot really do monadic analysis, like where you're just seeing from one single side of rhetorical, ideas. You have to kind of see what actually happened in the last 30 years. When you're talking to some African country and saying we are fighting on the side of human rights and Ukraine, and the Russians are, and they're going to point out the Middle East, and they're going to say do you remember that you were fighting the great war on terror for the last 20 years? How much money and weapons and things you lost, and what did you gain from that?
And how many lives?
Justifications?
How many lives were lost?
That's right. Yeah.
It was like the Nigerian intellectual who, when Queen Elizabeth died, it was like, oh, poor Queen Elizabeth. She was like, well, I'm Nigerian. I have a different perspective on. I know that she came along after colonization, but you can understand how a Nigerian would look at the monarchy a little bit differently. Yeah.
100%, absolutely. I'm not even gonna try and justify Britain, or British interventions in the Middle East. But that's just how things are, It's just, and so every time we talk about human rights, so that's one thing of the human rights. The second thing, which especially the Africans left out, if you talk to African diplomats, for example, the reason why China is gaining so much influence, it's a different topic for a different day, but broadly, the reason why China is gaining so much influence in Africa is because from the African perspective, they see that the Chinese are investing in their roads, and we are lecturing them on their LGBT rights.
That's right.
Human rights and values look very different when you're on the other side of the lens.
And by the way, add to that, please, the fact that we're giving the Africans a hard time on their LGBTQ rights when Qatar and Saudi Arabia and all of our Middle Eastern allies aren't exactly progressive and forward-thinking when it comes to LGBTQ. Yeah, so
we have Turkey. We have Turkey in NATO.
Exactly.
How can we just go and say that? And I don't want to sound like I'm trying and justifying our side of the Russians. That is not what I'm trying to do.
I know you're not. You're just saying we pay a price for our double standards, and that's just going to happen in geopolitics.
The reason what I'm trying to say is, it doesn't really matter whether we are good or bad. International politics is a game where the entire idea of good and bad doesn't exist. It's amoral. Yeah. At the end of the day, there are great powers and, they have their own core interests. And that's what realism is, You have to. It doesn't matter whether you're good or bad. What happens is how the other side sees you.
What happens if I'm going to put you in charge? And then after that, I'm going to ask you to predict how you see this thing working out anyway. But I'm going to put you in charge. My guess is the Russians are going to stay the course because they don't have a lot of faith in the American span of attention. I think at the end of the day, if the Russians can stick it out for another 2 years, American will and American enthusiasm for giving another 40, 50, 80 billion dollars to the Ukraine will begin to wane. And the Russians are probably going to bank on that. Barring that, if I make you emperor, are you pulling out of? I know it's not very fair, but if the United States says, okay, you win Russia, does Russia stop at Ukraine? In your opinion?
Yeah, yes. There is no question about that because in military strategy, threat is a combination of intention and capability. So I can intend to be James Bond, but at the end of the day, I'm a short and podgy man, and if I run 2 kilometers, I'm going to land up in a hospital. So my intention and my capability are entirely different.
Yes.
Same with the Russians. We have to understand Russia is not the Soviet Union. From the 1990s onwards, the Russians gave up essentially 17,000 square miles of defensible borders. Their military went down a notch. Their navy is dilapidated. Like they had their one single aircraft carrier in the English Channel was chugging smoke like an 1850 Manchester chimney. The Russians simply don't have the capacity to be a hegemon. The reason why the United States is interested in Europe is not because Europe whole and free. That's rhetoric. That's Reaganist. That's what we say. At the end of the day, the core interest is so that no one can launch invasion from the western parts. Germany, France, and UK are the 3, Poland maybe, are the 4 most important countries for the US.
Right.
In Europe. So the Russians at this point of time, their GDP is 1/18th of the entire European Union.
It's 1/18.
Their manpower is 100.
Wow.
1/18 of the entire European Union GDP. The Russian manpower is 144 million people compared to the European Union manpower of 438 million people, combined with the US manpower of 323 million people. So the Russians they don't have the manpower, they don't have the economy, their economy is lower than Italy, they don't have the production capacity. What they do have is thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons.
That they will use. Yeah, I don't think they would use them, but that's definitely it's definitely an attention getter.
If their state, we are not going to war with North Korea. Think of a country which has got 10 times the capacity of North Korea. We are not going to go to war with Russia. Regardless of how many times Anne Applebaum writes an article in the Atlantic, we are not doing that. At least not like she is in charge. No.
She's always
as long as there are people who are sensible in Pentagon. Yeah, no one is going to go to war with Russia. Now, before the war, Russians at least had the capacity of having some kind of nuisance if they wanted to do it in a smart way. What they didn't know, and this is a Russian mistake, because Russia is an authoritarian country. In any authoritarian country, you don't go and talk to the dictator or to the leader that you're wrong about your assessment, right? You're sycophants. Now, the Russian military structure were based with, full of sycophants who said Ukraine is going to capitulate, we're just going to march through. Think of it this way. If you are doing tabletop strategy and you have 90,000 troops to invade a country of 37 million people, the second largest country in the entirety of European landmass, right? Massive country. The US had 140 million troops at the peak of its surge in Iraq, and it couldn't pacify. The Russians thought they're just going to have 90,000 troops, have 4 different axes, not just one single thrust to Kiev, but 4 different sides axes. They're going to bombard, and the Ukrainians are just going to give up their weapons and arms and just move west. That didn't happen. That was a big mistake on their part. And the reason that was a mistake is because they had flawed intelligence, because no one went and told Putin that what you're saying is not going to happen.
The same problem with Xi. Everybody's
they
afraid.
Just went through their idea.
Everybody's afraid to tell Xi the truth. Everybody's afraid to tell Putin the truth. This is the liability of being a dictator and having temporary.
That's right.
Yeah. Although you said something about Putin.
That's right.
Yeah, go on.
But the difference between I just wanted to have like short difference. Like the reason why China is a much bigger threat to the United States than Russia is because yes, Xi Jinping and Putin are both authoritarians, but China is 10 times the size of Russia.
And
Chinese
a lot
economy is
wealthier.
massive.
Yeah.
Chinese manpower is 1.4 billion people.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, if they can have 1 million or 2 million people under arms within 2 weeks, Russians cannot do that.
Jesus.
We cannot do that.
No, that's crazy.
Yeah.
But you said something interesting in an interview.
Yeah, China is a different beast.
You said something interesting that I hadn't thought of. Putin has not really conscripted people for the war. There's no mandatory draft right now, is there? I'm very surprised at that. In Russia?
No.
Am I wrong?
No, they've got partial mobilization for 2 reasons. One, from Putin's perspective, he initially thought that he could scare the Ukrainians away, and that obviously didn't work out. So he's kind of like changing. Again, no one can be privy to what the inner circles of Kremlin are talking about, but from what you can see from their force positioning, from the kind of weapons that they're using, they're also very. Okay, let me put it this way: they want to signal, especially after the sinking of Moscow, and they realize that they cannot launch a naval invasion of Odessa, which was needed for controlling the entirety of the southern border of Ukraine. That's what Putin originally thought, that one, he's going to go from the top and take Kiev, one axis. The 2 second and third axis would be from Donbass and Crimea. Crimea is already under Russian, power. Donbass, the entirety of the Donbass Valley would have Russian soldiers. And the fourth would be from the left, from Odessa, from the south left, from Odessa. And Odessa, because it's a historic port, it's going to cut off the entirety of Ukrainian southern coastline, and the entirety of Black Sea would be Russian control. They couldn't do that because we were the ones providing the Ukrainians with targeting coordinates, and that sucks. Moscow didn't sink itself. The Ukrainians had no capability of doing that. The only people who could do that were the Brits, the Norwegians, and the Americans.
Yeah.
They were the ones providing coordinate. And this is an interesting thing actually. If you someday have a guest of international law, they might be able to say better than me whether we are actually, by doing that, co-belligerent, according to international. But anyway, that's a different topic. That's not my area of expertise. So that's what the Russians originally thought of doing. But now that they know that they are not being able to do that, at least in the near term, because the Ukrainians have 1 million people, they're trained constantly, they're getting weapons, supplies, and obviously, the Russian army has been decimated because of. They send, because of their flawed intelligence, because they thought the Ukrainians are going to capitulate, they send the Rosgvardia troops, which is the Russian version of National Guards, with just rifles, march to the center of a city where they were massacred.
God.
Imagine sending the Maryland National Guards to Basra in the middle of 2007.
Jesus.
That's what it was horrible. It was a bloodbath. So
Russians are being slaughtered. Russians at this point are being.
Well, they were in the initial stages of. Now they've kind of changed the tactic and they've dug in defensive lines and they're not moving forward much. But in the beginning of the war, like in between February to June, it was an absolute bloodbath. One of the reasons why Putin had to do the second stage of partial mobilization is because his first army was massacred. They just couldn't land.
Do we have an idea?
Their entire BDV.
Do we have any idea how many Russians have died in this war?
That's very difficult to say. And you would hear nothing that you would read now would be accurate because that's all part of propaganda. It's just a fact.
It's over 100,000. Over 100,000, would you say?
My guess would be a little lower than that, but casualty-wise, yeah, definitely around 90 to 100,000 total casualties. Not number of dead, by the way. Casualties could be injury.
What do you see?
Yeah.
How do you see this playing out? Is this a winnable war for Ukraine? It's not.
No.
There's no way.
It's not. No, I mean define winning. Define winning.
Winning is a Russian.
What does winning look like in this equation?
It looks like a Russian retreat because the Russians have no choice. They've been too decimated. They can't afford it, et cetera, et cetera.
Russian retreat from where? From Crimea or from Donbass?
Well, definitely Donbass.
Those are very different equations.
Well, I would say Russian retreat from eastern Ukraine altogether.
No, not going to happen. At least I don't see that happening.
What is life like?
I don't see that happening.
What's life like for the average Eastern Ukraine, and is it different than the average Western Ukraine?
Well, the Eastern Ukrainians are obviously impoverished, but also there are parts of Eastern Ukraine who are like dogmatically Russian. An invasion force in general needs to have 3 times the manpower of the defensive force. The ratio of invasion to defense, usually, it's kind of like a thumb rule, it needs to be like 3-1. The number of people the Russians lost when they were moving west, equally, it kind of like shows the exact ratio. If Ukraine had to go back and recover the number of people in the Ukraine, we tend to forget the Ukrainians are also losing a lot of men. And Ukraine is a smaller country. And as long as there is Gandalf and cavalry not coming from the west, and that's not going to come because Russians have nukes, they are also keep on, they're going to continue to lose the number of men, which is, if not the same as the Russians, at least near parity. Right?
How many people have...
if Russians are losing 100...
Yeah, let's go. I'm sorry. Keep going.
No, if Russians are losing around 100,000, it's sensible to estimate that the Ukrainians are also losing, maybe not exactly equal, but an equal number of men. Like a lot of Ukrainian refugees have moved to the west who are like mostly children and women. So Ukraine is kind of like, but their men cannot leave. They're having to go to war and they're dying, right? So, and if they have to recover the eastern parts of Ukraine, they have to kind of gather the number of people that would be 3 times what their current force is because they're a defensive force now. So to take over, to go face Russian artillery, go through the landmines, have 3 or 4 different axes, go to Crimea. I hate to say that, but this is a war that needs to come to a negotiated settlement at one point or some or the other.
Will that happen? And what does that look like?
That looks like, I don't see that happening at least in the next 1 year, because the Ukrainians want to fight. They have a significant amount of weapons and money that they've gotten from us. And up until they have decimated that supply chain, and there is a threat that we are pushing them towards the negotiating table, I don't think they're willing to go and negotiate. It's their country, and they're absolutely justified to have that patriotism. Right? I mean, if US was invaded, if UK was invaded, we'd feel exactly the same.
But a negotiated settlement definitely has Russia holding on to Crimea.
Absolutely.
And guarantees of Russian security, no NATO membership, things like that. I don't know why the Ukrainians don't go to the negotiating table now, but it's
NATO membership is not going to happen as long as Ukraine has an active war zone in Ukraine. So what Ukraine can do is divide Ukraine and partition and say, the western parts of Ukraine is not a war zone, and we can be NATO member. The western parts of Ukraine, the western Ukraine, as a whole country. But as long as they are willing to, or they're at least inflexible about giving away a significant chunk of their country to the Russians. They are an active war zone, and that's the same for Georgia. And the eastern parts of Georgia are under Russian occupation. It's an active war zone. They're not going to be NATO, and NATO is it's an alliance of 30 countries. If one country vetoes that, and they are absolutely right to veto that because they don't want to go to a nuclear war with Russia.
Sure.
So to answer your question, in the near term, I don't think. I think the Russians are still, they still see a glimmer of hope that they can keep a lot of what they have. A lot of things would be played out on how the Ukrainian counteroffensive happens in June or July. That's when they are planning to have a second amount counteroffensive. I don't know how much they'll be able to do that because the Europeans are not pulling, and the European armory is almost decimated. Like they have splurged on this peacetime dividend, so it's gone.
Yeah.
So we are the ones who are paying for it.
Is there any threat to Putin? Does Putin go to sleep thinking maybe he'll be replaced by some hawk like his interior defense minister or whoever that guy, I can't remember his name, but it's pretty cutthroat. The idea that he stayed in power for 24 years among all those, it's such a cutthroat system.
Yeah.
To rise to the top of Russian power, you've got to be pretty ruthless yourself, I would imagine. So,
well, there is a statistical possibility of Putin not being in power anyway, regardless of whether he's toppled or not, because he's 70 years old.
That's true.
And he's not really that healthy. He's like full of cholesterol and all that kind of stuff. So
is he really? He's not healthy?
Oh yeah. I mean, from yeah, he's not. Again, I don't know the exact details, but he's from the assessment that you see on intelligence communities, for example. Like Putin is not really it's not in his prime, obviously. But that is a very different threat to us. Every time Russians had a change in power, it didn't really always go well. We kind of have this understanding, this liberal worldview that everything is a progress, everything is going to go better at some point in time. But, the Tsarist regime went away and what came into power is far, far worse compared to the Tsar. So I'm not, and even if there is this saying in international relations, at least in the realist theory, that tyranny is better than anarchy.
Well, tyranny has some order. Anarchy is total chaos.
Yes, absolutely. The point of tyranny is tyranny has rules, and the moment you have rules, you can find out the way to
predict
predict stuff. Whereas anarchy. Imagine a country of 144 million people, and people say like, "Oh, we need to decolonize Russia. We need to break Russia up like the Soviet Union." Can you imagine if you remember the 1990s, the early 90s?
Yeah,
there was a heavy threat that if Yeltsin is toppled, we don't know what's going to happen to the nukes.
Well, let me tell you.
Our prime concern.
Yeah, let me tell you what happened. I can tell you, my dad tried to get some business off the ground in Russia. It was, there was all these resources, and my father, trying to be an entrepreneur, which he wasn't, goes to Russia. He spoke Russian, and he goes there, and the three other guys he knew who were trying to get businesses off the ground got shot. They came and shot him and took their business, and then
it was pure chaos.
Yeah, and then they were selling nukes. Nukes were just there, and people were taking control of them. And we had to have our science at the Department of Energy kind of track down where all these nukes were. It was chaos. Right. You don't want that country going. Are you out of your mind? With all that nuclear power, are you out of your mind? People who say that are they just don't live in the real world. They live somewhere else.
Yes. Absolutely.
So it drives me
nuts.
No,
I'm glad you agree. Like, this is so difficult to, and especially in the current, like, polarized, situation. Like, if you go and debate and say, like, you know what, I don't like Putin, but I'd rather have him in power than some absolute fascist or, some
He's
communist
predictable.
power.
You can negotiate with
Or
Putin.
worse, just breaks up. Imagine the Chechens having nukes.
Forget it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. I was expecting to disagree with you more, but you seem to be making a lot of sense. And you know what you are as a pragmatic, you're a realist, and that's what geopolitics. That's what geopolitics is. You can take you can have your ideals. You can talk about human rights. You can talk about democracy. You can talk about all these things. At the end of the day, countries behave in their own interest. Geopolitics is geopolitics. I think it was Nixon or Kissinger wrote a book called Real Peace. I read it as a young man. I never forgot it. The idea behind Real Peace is you have to take the profit out of war. If a country sees there's profit in aggression, they will take aggression. The way you ensure your own peace is by ensuring any country that thinks there's a profit in invading your country, there is no gold here, my friend, only pain and misery for you. That's how you do realpolitik. That's what true détente is about. But I'm a child of the 80s. I come from that. And people, I think, in this world don't remember that stuff. I mean, the younger generation.
I want to just say a small thing, which I constantly try and kind of like harp on. You're absolutely right. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with anything that you said. But when people say that, or when people like us, we go and say that, hey, we are realists, and we don't want to invest too much in Ukraine, and it's not in our interest. It's not because we are pacifists. It's not because we think Russia is a nice country and tomorrow it's going to be a nice dictator, a democracy. The reason we say is, number one, if America keeps on paying, my friend Justin Logan wrote a great paper called Uncle Sucker. If we keep on paying, the Europeans are not going to. If someone is going to come and pay your rent and food, why would you work? It's very simple. So that's one thing. Second, our risk of nuclear war is not because Crimea is under Russia. Our risk of nuclear war is because when Canada is under occupation by a hostile force, that's when we could go to a nuclear war. We could go to a nuclear war for Cuba, not for Crimea. So geography matters. And the third most important point is if we are sending all our money, we are printing more money, which leads to inflation. If we are not creating problems for us, if we are just essentially losing all our military stockpile, tomorrow when the real war comes in Taiwan, we won't be able to do anything.
Well, that's right.
So there's a lot of reasons.
As you're talking, I'm thinking of the ledger. I just see a ledger, and if all the numbers are on over here, then something's wrong. We got to have a balanced ledger here.
That's right.
And I appreciate your perspective, Doctor. You're a good man.
Absolutely.
And
thank you very much. I appreciate you bringing me. It was great to talk.
Well, I love it. I like bringing these ideas to my audience because, people should know. You see, people think that this is not relevant. It is relevant. It's relevant because if you don't think it is, it's going to come to you. You have to be somewhat politically and philosophically committed. If you're not, you're gonna be used for the wrong ends, and I think it's important to educate yourself. It's not that hard, and I appreciate your perspective. Keep on keeping on, my friend. You're always welcome back. Especially
thank you very much. Absolutely.
Yeah, if you write a book or whatever, we'd be happy to showcase it because I like the way your brain works.
I am actually writing a book. It's not really writing. I'm transforming our PhD thesis to a book because it's on Russian military strategy. So I'm trying to finish a draft by August this month, but I'm going to send you a copy next year when it comes out.
Please do.
Happy. Yeah,
please
absolutely.
do. I'll read it and we'll get you on.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Maitra, thank you very much. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
At Mr. Maitra, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
See you later, buddy. Thanks.
Thank you.